What dark family secret / family history have you uncovered? We found a picture of two great aunts arm in arm with Hitler. We also have a signed photograph of Mussolini. That my great-great-great-grandpa left England for America and was supposed to send money for them to come over. But he never did. He just started a new family in America. Found out my father had a secret family and that we were it. His wife and kids don't know about us to this day. Also found out a while later that an uncle had an ex-wife and kids he kept quiet about too. My great-great-grandfather owed gambling debt to his former best friend. Apparently after a night of gambling in which my ancestor somehow ducked over his best friend, a firefight erupted at my grandfather's house. His best friend pulled a shotgun on him, but missed and hit his own wife who was at my grandfather's house visiting with my grandfather's wife. My grandfather was hit in the neck by a single buckshot pellet that forever stayed lodged in the side of the neck. Several months later, my great-great-grandfather disappeared. After a manhunt, a body was found, cut in 3 on the railroad tracks. The head was missing, but whoever found the body brought back the 6-gun and whiskey flask off of the body, and my great-great-grandmother confirmed them to be her husband's. Now, for the big twist. Apparently, it was rumored that my grandfather had another family in a different state, that he would disappear too often for long periods of time. The head of the body on the tracks was never found. Family legend has it that my ancestor killed a man and planted his own personal items on the body and did away with the head of the body. Now his debts and blood feud were covered and he could forever live with his other family. R.I.P. great-great-grandpa Charles. You should bag. My great-grandfather had 3 families. 2 in the States and 1 in Canada. There are 2 killers on my dad's side of the family. One murdered his wife. The other was a female serial killer, Aileen Wuornos. A movie was made about her, Monster, and she was my dad's cousin's child. Never met either one though. Have a second cousin that murdered his siblings and parents for insurance money. He didn't get away with it, but only spent around 20 years in prison. He's out now, but no one talks about him or will speak to him. The only reason I even know is my parents warned me if he ever reaches out to me that I shouldn't talk to him. I managed to find out about him and what happened by googling him. Edit. To answer the questions. The murders happened in the late 70s. He was sentenced to 45 years, but only served 20. He was a minor. After he got out, it caused a pretty big uproar to the point that they changed the law. Believe it or not, it happened in Texas. My grandfather, white, may have fathered 1 or 2 kids with the black lady across the street. This was a big no-no in the southern U.S. in the 1940s. My mother told me a story about being at a small funeral in the late 1950s, East Texas. The deceased was mentally challenged, and the family was relieved to have the child at peace. During the service, the coffin began to rock, and crying was heard. Then she was taken outside and watched as the coffin was carried to the cemetery next to the church and hurriedly buried. I was telling my kids this years later, and my mother walked in the room, listened for a moment, and asked, "Are you telling them about Uncle Chucky? What? You seem to have forgotten to mention the connection before, Mom." Edit. I cannot swear to the authenticity of the tale, but my mother swore by it, and she was not the joking sort. It has caused a decent amount of dark brooding about being buried alive in my youth. When my mother died, I found out my uncle is really my dad. My great-grandfather was an artsy captain, like pretty high up. He even had Heinrich Himmler himself over for dinner at one time, if I recall correctly. After the war was over he fled and got prosecuted. Not sure what happened to him after that. It's not exactly dark Parisi, but my great uncle on my father's side is widely considered an idiot. So my dad's family are very recent immigrants from Italy, and I guess my great uncle decided he wanted to visit his homeland. He was born there, but raised in America. The problem was he apparently was completely oblivious to what was going on in the world. Because he went to Italy in 1938. He ended up getting drafted into the Italian military since he was born there. Unfortunately for him, he was completely unaware he didn't actually have to join the Italian military, as the US would have contested it had he tried to get into contact with an embassy or something. Luckily for him, he was only assigned to patrol around Italy, and Italy surrendered/turned on Mussolini before the Allies advanced far enough to encounter my great uncle. It was all apparently very awkward, since my grandfather and the rest of his brothers had been part of the US military and fought in Europe. TLDR, my great uncle is probably the only guy to accidentally join the wrong side of WW2. Edit, Paresi. I have shamed my Roman ancestors. My mother's best friend, Peggy Catino, was abducted, raped and killed by serial killer Pee Wee Gaskins while walking home from school. My mom left her on a street corner to run get something she left behind at school. Got back and she was gone. Never seen again until she was found dead in the woods. It wasn't necessarily a secret, but nobody talked about the picture on the mantle at my aunt and uncle's. I found out a few years ago that they had lost their oldest child, of 3, when he was 11 to leukemia. He had been my dad's best friend, changed a lot about who they were, and gave me new perspective on them. Sweetest people ever, but there is a never-ending sadness there. Parents should never have to bury their children. I have been looking into my ancestry a bit recently and got quite confused when I stumbled across one of my grandmother's birth certificates, since it listed a female in the father section. Turns out my great-grandmother, who was living in a big port city in her youth, got knocked up by a foreign sailor who was never heard of again. However, at the time her mother could not register a newborn with the authorities. It had to be her husband or another patron. So her aunt, whom she lived with at the time, had to go to the authorities to do the paperwork, putting her name in the father box. Edit. I also remember that I asked about this story before when I had to do an ancestry chart for school, and my family told me that the great-grandfather was lost at sea, which I in my head led to a tragic story of love and loss. Well, maybe it was. The fact that there was no name should tip me off though. Close bracket. PS. Since I'm from the eastern part of Germany, there is also all the Nazi and Stasi family history a lot of people happen to have around here and don't like to talk about. Makes filling out an ancestry chart rather challenging but also interesting. Not a secret or anything, but my great-grandmother survived the Armenian genocide at some point by playing dead and hiding under dead bodies. Family members told us the story that my uncle's wife died in a car accident they were both involved in. They live out of state. After he was arrested, we found out that the accident was him running his convertible under a semi-truck and decapitating her on purpose. My great-uncle stole a train while drunk. It's kind of weird. My dad was involved with some criminals in California. It wasn't like the blacklist or some shit, but they organized and did some pretty shitty things. My dad doesn't tell me much, but I do remember that we moved to Ohio with no real prompting. Years later, him talking to him about my family history and ask him why we moved hella far from the family. My father was quiet for a few minutes and just breathing heavily. Me, Dad, something wrong? Apostrophe. D, son. We moved because I saw a man kill a baby and I had to get out of that organization. Apostrophe. M. I just moved on. I don't even ducking know anything about my father's past, and now I'm sure I don't want to. Grandfather may have been a war criminal. He was born in the UK to a German family and spent half his childhood in Germany. For the rest of his life he would be able to fool Germans that he was one of them and then snap back into Yorkshire English equally convincingly. He wouldn't tell us too much about the war. We knew he was a special weapons expert and was regularly recalled by the army to consult well into the 1980s. But some of the stories he told read like excerpts from the film Inglourious Basterds. Pretty sure he spent several days as part of an Afrika Korps support battalion sabotaging it from the inside before leaving at night in a half-track with the last of their working weapons. We know on at least one occasion he drove a lorry into a Wehrmacht arms dump to make a delivery of shells and bullets that wouldn't work, having ensured the truck that was full of the real ones and expected would never be found or arrive. He was a member of the British Army right through the war. Not sure what was going on, but it seems it was all illegal. Geneva Convention is fairly direct about never wearing enemy uniforms in the field of battle. In the military. Found out my grandpa was on his deathbed. Jumped through several hoops to take a week of emergency leave to make it to his funeral and support my dad through the ordeal. Spent the week helping the family out. 2 days before the funeral, I found out that my grandpa was a raging pedophile who had sexually assaulted several of my cousins and attempted to assault my sister. Most of my family knew about the rumors, but not that he had went after my sister. Everyone still went to the funeral under the pretense of supporting my grandma, even though she was in denial about the abuse and claimed the kids made it up. I can't look at her the same, and even though I love my family to death, I don't know how they can act like this never happened. I left the morning of the funeral. That bastard died too good of a death, and I hope someone waters the flowers on his grave with their piss. My great aunt and uncle were the sweetest people imaginable. When I was growing up they lived 4 houses down, so I used to go around to their house a lot after school. My uncle Jimmy used to play dollars and tea party with me. I have very fond memories of them. When my uncle Jimmy died I remember all these very professional looking old men at his funeral, surrounded by what looked like to me security guards. My mum casually mentioned to me many years later that my uncle Jimmy was an old-fashioned English gangster. He did time for robbery and sex trafficking. He was also accused of murdering 4 people, but there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. I was gobsmacked. Additional to this, my lovely auntie Diane, his wife, was the madam at one of his brothels and recruited his sex slaves. She had also done time. I put 2 and 2 together and realized those men at his funeral were old gangsters. It really messed me up. Not really super dark, but it was supposed to be secret. I was conceived in a threesome between my mother, my dad, and his identical twin. Can't get a DNA test because they're identical twins. But the one who took on the role of uncle bought me a pony when I was a kid, so it's cool. My great grandfather was a bootlegger and later, allegedly, a cannibal during the Great Depression. I say allegedly because his friends claimed it was a rumor he started to keep people from messing with his family. They could never disprove it, though, because even up to his death he swore he'd eaten the rival's liver. I should note he was a Native American, so he got the nickname Wen, short for Wendigo. My grandpa said it was all for show, though, cause Wen had to fight over things like milk and threaten the power company employees to keep them from turning the power off. I have no idea how much is true, cause it seemed to be embellished all the way up to my grandpa's death. My great grandmother was a dirty Irish scamming whore. Sorry nanny. In WW2 she used to scam multiple American and British soldiers who would come to Liverpool to be sent to the European front all at once into marrying her. Then collect a percentage of their pay and pawn any jewelry she was given. She was the queen of dependence. I knew my grandmother had had my oldest uncle out of wedlock to someone else and was pregnant a second time when she married my grandfather. He was a brave man to take on someone else's child in the 1930s. Years later, after my parents had died, I was doing a little family history and looked at my uncle's birth date and my grandma's birth date. She would have been 14 or 15. The baby daddy was supposed to be some rich prick who took advantage of her when she worked in the big house, supposedly. I don't know about her and my granddad. When you look at this sweet little old lady, you couldn't imagine her being in that situation. Even in the few photos we have when she was younger than I'm now, it's hard to imagine. And I guess now, I'll never know. Please subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.